As you know, I'm Dave, SWmobile organiser, Android contractor, and today I just want to cover a quick introduction to experimentation in apps, mainly focusing on Optimizely X full stack, which we use here at Just Eat and we've recently migrated to using, but we have used Firebase A/B testing in the past as well, and so just wanted to share a few things about what to consider when using an A/B testing framework and share some insights from what we've learned here. So first of all, why would you want to experiment with an app? Most of you are probably familiar with user testing, and the idea of user testing is typically have like a one-to-one with someone from your team and a real user of your app, or perhaps somebody who would want to use your app. And you might test a prototype or maybe a more polished feature, and you're looking for feedback as to, is something new you've created good? Do they struggle to use it? Do they understand what it does? Do they do the thing that you want them to do, which you're aiming to do through that feature? And while user testing can help test ideas at small scale and to iterate on that feature before you actually push it into a production app, the aim of experimentation is really to test what is the impact of that change once you ship it to the masses, depending on how big your app is, obviously how big your audience is. And the idea of A/B testing is to objectively measure these changes at a large scale, so you've got confidence in, has it degraded the app experience, has it improved the app experience, rather than just what is somebody who's sat across from a sofa from you saying about your app because they want to say nice things because they're getting paid a bit of money to give you feedback on it. And at the grander scale of thousands of users, you're going to get a more probably accurate result. And when you're going through feature iteration, you might come up with multiple designs for features. So there might be disagreement internally, like, well, would this be best or would this be best? And you might not necessarily come to an agreement over what you think's best, and what you think may not be what your users think is the best way to do something. So it's quite often that you might want to test multiple variants of a feature to find out, well, which is the winner, and it helps settle arguments because you just can't. You can bet on something, but you can't know what the result's going to be. So while small-scale user or beta testing may give you some insights as to whether a change is going to be for the better or worse, you'll probably need to do wider testing to find a definitive winner. And you probably want, if you're looking at say for example conversion in your app and you're wanting to continuously improve that, you're going to want to run multiple experiments to do that. And so each of those experiments may give you small gains or might give you negative gains, in which case you're going to get rid of them. But that's why you might want to experiment. So an A/B test is basically a method of comparing two or more versions of your app experience against each other to determine which performs better. So for example, in this one you might have a buy now button with a black background versus a white background, and just making that call to action more visible to somebody might have an impact on what they do. A very cursory example. In Optimizely, how you would go about creating an A/B test like this is you go in, you create a unique ID to identify that experiment. You can put in a quick description of your hypothesis. So in this hypothetical example, saying adding Apple Pay option during checkout will improve the likelihood of a user placing an order. It might also have an effect on whether they come back in future to order, because they think, okay, that was easy. I don't have to put my delivery address in, it comes from Apple. I don't have to put any CVV numbers in because it's coming from Apple, and so on. So if you're integrating Apple Pay into your app and you want to be able to boast to your CEO how much you've improved conversion or average order value or something like that, you'd probably want to run a test on it to be able to validate that. So once you've created your experiment, you can then decide what level of traffic you want to expose your users to, and you then divide that audience by however many variants you have. So in this case, you might have three variants where you've got Apple Pay disabled. You might have Apple Pay as a sort of primary call to action, so above like your existing card cash payment options, or you might put it below, and depending on how that is arranged on your screen, you might get different results. We actually did a test with Google Pay as to, like, because the branding of the Google Pay button always has to be the same to match Google's branding requirements, but we experimented with what the other call to action would be, so check out through the card cash payment option, and to see if that would have an effect. So you divide your audience into two or more. Generally your A is your control, so that's what your existing behaviour is, so your default behaviour, and then you can experiment with multiple additional variants, which you call your B or your C. You could have an A, B, C, D, E, F, G experiment if you want, but the more you split your traffic, the more people you'll probably need to go through that experiment to find a significant result. I'll come to that in a sec. So you can limit the traffic to less than 100% of your users if you want to, and you can do this with pretty much any A/B testing framework. I'm using Optimizer here as an example, but you can decide how many people you want to target with that experiment, and within each experiment you probably want to keep the traffic allocations between the variants the same. For statistical reasons, I'll come to that again in a sec, but if you start tweaking, say your default to have more users than others, it will take you longer to get to a result. You can also, with most A/B testing frameworks, you can select audiences within your user population to run an experiment on. And you can either do it with everybody in the app, or you can segment it and say, okay, I only want to do it with logged in users or users that have given me location permission, say if it's a location specific feature you want to experiment with. And then once you've selected an audience, you then decide, okay, what is it we're going to measure? So how are we going to decide if this experiment's been successful or not? And in this example, say for example a checkout experiment, you would probably want to check, you would probably want to measure overall revenue and probably checkout completion. So do they get to the point where they've placed an order or whatever they would have to do within your apps. And with most A/B testing tools, you can measure your results with multiple metrics. So you might define your overall revenue to be your primary metric, but you can also look at others, and it will tell you whether you've got a winner based on your primary metric, but you can also drill down to your other ones and see what impact that's had. But you should also think carefully about what it is you want to measure. So if you've got an experiment fairly early in your, say, checkout funnel, so somebody, in the case of Just Eat, they're searching for restaurants and you're making it easier for them to find a restaurant, you don't necessarily want to measure as a primary goal whether they check out at the end. You might want to measure, okay, do they add to cart, or do they spend less time having to search for something before they get to the point where they're going to check out. So think about whether the metric that you're trying to measure in an experiment is relevant and as close to that experiment as possible. The further you do it down the funnel, the longer it will take to, the more other factors might come into it as to what you're measuring. And once you've created that in Optimizer, it gives you example code at the bottom of the console saying, right, if you want to run this code in your app, copy this in. I've done it in Swift because obviously it's Apple Pay, so I thought let's just use the Swift example here. And you'll notice that it's got the three variants at the top here, but also you've got to consider what happens if somebody's not in the experiment. So if the experiment's off, if you decided to turn the experiment off in an app release, or if they're outside of an audience, then actually you end up with like two default paths. So you've either got like they're not in the experiment, so they're in this path, or they are in the experiment but they're in the control group. And this API is a little bit clunky. You probably want to put a wrapper around this to say, treat those two as the same. You don't need to handle them differently. They are the default sort of A case of your thing. And when you call most Optimizer APIs, you pass in a unique user ID, which you have to create locally. For consistent bucketing, you probably want to make sure that that is both random, so it doesn't match what might be on someone else's device, and two, make it persistent across multiple sessions. And if you want to be testing with new users coming into your app, perhaps before they've signed up, don't just use your, what would be your internal user ID within your platform. So your subscriber ID or whatever you want to call them. Make it so that it would persist across logging in, logging out. Otherwise, you may end up with them being bucketed into different experiments because it uses that user ID to determine which bucket you go into for any given experiment. And I think that's pretty much the same across any A/B testing framework. I think maybe Firebase does it randomly for you. You don't have the control over that. But Optimizely certainly does require you to do that. And again, you don't want to be having to pass a user ID in from your, say, your fragment or your activity. You would just probably want to wrap that up inside an experiment manager that passes in that ID, and you just initialize it when you launch the app. That's certainly what we do here. So let's say you have a feature which you think is going to significantly affect your conversion rate on your app, and let's say it's got a current conversion rate of 35%, and you think that your experiment could have a 2% relative impact on that, so 35 plus or minus 2% of 35. If you want to be able to say, if you want to be able to run an experiment and conclusively say to a 95% confidence that you have got a conclusive result, then the chances are you're going to need a sample size per variation of 81,000 users going through the app in each of those variants. So if you've got a 3-variant experiment, you could be talking 240,000 users, which a lot of apps don't have anything like that much. So you may need to sacrifice statistical significance confidence. So you might say, okay, our PM actually only wants to be 85%, or the PM wants to be 85% confident we got the right result here, or that we proved that we haven't damaged conversion or so on. So think about what it is you're measuring. This sample size will vary depending on what your conversion rate is, how much you want to detect a change, and what statistical confidence you want. And this is basically there's fairly rudimentary statistical equations to be able to work this out. This tool on Optimizely's website is slightly tweaked for the way that they measure things and the way they exclude outliers, but it's similar principle that if you want to prove that if you say you were like, this is going to massively increase conversion, you wouldn't need as big a sample size to prove that, because if it has indeed had that impact, you would know it with a smaller size population. But if you think it's only going to move your conversion rate from, say, 35% to 36%, which is say a 3% detectable difference, then you're probably going to need quite a lot of traffic. So that's something to bear in mind if you have an app with a relatively small number of users, or vice versa if you're segmenting your audiences to be smaller than your overall population. And you could define audiences in the case of Optimizely by setting attributes. So when you launch the app, you might say, okay, I've got this package ID, this version code, this version name, or you might say, this user has given me the location permission, so I'm going to just record that into the SDK, and then you can then define an audience. So you can say, right, in the case of Just Eat, we have a multi-flavour app, so we use a global project for all of our countries, and we can say, right, I want to target Australian users with the Australian Menulog app who have got location enabled in the app, and you can create an audience for that. You can run experiments across multiple audiences, and then you can segment the results based on those audiences, but just bear in mind that the more segmentation you do, the more analysis you'll have to do of the results afterwards. And then when you get results, you'll see something like this. So in the case of a 3-variant experiment, you'll see number of visitors and number of unique conversions, and it will calculate the conversion rate for you, tell you what the difference of each of the 2 variants compared to the A cases, and then it will tell you what the confidence interval. So ideally, you want to be ending up with a confidence interval which is not overlapping with the 0 here. And that basically says, yeah, you have definitely beaten or definitely not beaten your control group. And it will also tell you the current state of things with number of visitors and number of conversions you've had, whether you are anywhere close to reaching statistical significance. So in this case, it's saying you need 81,000 more visitors before you're going to get to 95% significance, and it will say, right, now you're the winner. We're conclusively past that point. But these numbers will fluctuate day by day as you're looking at the results. So although you want to look at results after you launch an experiment, don't get too stressed about it early on, or don't get too excited about, oh, it says I've got to move conversion 2%, because until you've got the large numbers of users coming through, it means nothing basically, unless you might see that something's tanked, and then you do obviously want to action that. So basically, experimentation via an A/B testing framework is basically remote control of your app. So it can be quite powerful, but it also presents some challenges for mobile apps, because what if the user's on a slow connection? What if they're offline when they launch your app? What if they've just installed it from the App Store and they haven't downloaded the configuration yet? So if you were to wait during app launch to fetch a new experiment configuration and not do anything else, just have a progress bar on your splash screen, that might not be the best performance-wise, or from a product point of view, your product manager might say, no, we don't want to sacrifice user experience for that. So with optimizing Firebase, you have the option to fetch your new config at app launch, but not actually apply it until the next time you launch it. So it will always use your cached config on the next session. What that can do, obviously, is it can bias your experiment population to be people who frequently use the app, i.e. like if you run an experiment for 3 weeks and your typical user only comes once every 3 weeks, then chances are they'll get a config which will include an experiment, but they won't come back and actually see that experiment until the next session. So that could be beyond the end of your experiment. So think about how long that you might need for that. What we do at Just Eat is we fetch the config at launch. We don't apply it until the second session, but every time we ship an app update with an updated data file, on an Android at least, we have a package update receiver which listens for an intent for the Play Store when you have an update. And what we do is, because that happens typically in the background, we then clear the cached config, we bundle the experiment config with the app at the time, and that means that on the first launch of the app, and for first users, they could be immediately bucketed into new experiments that we've shipped in that app. I'll come on to that in a sec. So when you're thinking about that, think about what's going to be your strategy for activating your fetched experiment configuration. You don't want to be activating it midway through a session, because you might then change the experience that somebody might have on the screen they go back to. It might be like, whoa, I've just seen something completely different then, or they might be bucketed out of an experiment that you've decided to stop running. And if you bundle the configuration, consider whether you need to delete it upon upgrade, so you're not just using a cached one. Firebase and Optimizely work the same way. They have this idea of a cached config. And when you're considering like which A/B testing framework to use, apart from cost considerations, there can also be considerations about whether you need to integrate it with existing analytics that you have within your app. So in the case of Firebase, A/B testing is built on top of their remote config API, and their remote config API is fairly simple. It just says, give me this feature, this variable, and it doesn't tell you whether you've got that variable as part of an experiment or whether you've got that variable as just part of a standard remote config rollout. So from an app's point of view, you can't work out whether you are in an experiment or not. And if you want to report your variant to another analytics tool that your company use, you're going to struggle. Optimizely does have an experiment impression tracker, which you can register for callbacks when a user sees an experiment within your app. So that is much more flexible and allows you to integrate with other SDKs. Sorry. So when shouldn't you experiment? So as I said, you quite often, if you're going to not move the needle very far, you might need a heck of a lot of users' sessions to actually measure a significant change. It's easy to get bogged down in experimentation, and waiting for a significant result can seriously slow down the evolution of your app. So you should consider whether every change in your app warrants an experiment. If you have a limited number of active users, your chances of reaching a significant result can be slim, depending on what the scale of that is and what the kind of metric you're trying to move. And similarly, if your experiment is on a less well-trodden journey within your app, so say if it's something on like a preference screen, or if it's something on the login flow, if 99% of your users are already logged in, then you're not really going to get much result from testing your login screen, depending on what your ratio of unauthenticated to authenticated users is. And you shouldn't underestimate the value you might gain from user testing as a precursor to any experimentation. you might, you certainly shouldn't dismiss user testing entirely, because you're going to learn probably a lot more during the ideation phase and the implementation phase of a feature through user testing than you are going to through experimentation. And extending that, you shouldn't treat your A/B testers as your QA guinea pigs. Make sure that you test all variants of the experiment before you ship. Make sure you monitor the app stability for all your variants, and definitely don't A/B test bug fixes. If your app is crashing, why would you only want to fix your experience for a subset of your users? Don't A/B test bug fixes. But what if there are bugs? You've got to mitigate for what could happen in that scenario. You've got a remotely controllable app, which somebody could go in and tweak the config of, and break an experiment, even like mid-experiment. So make sure you measure the performance of your app when you roll out experiments. Keep an eye on your console, whether it's Optimizely, but also your crash rates, your whatever you use, Crashlytics, app reviews. If people start saying, I can't check out what the hell's going on. What have you broken? Why have you broken this for me? And you're like, what are you talking about? And then you go, ah, shit, yeah, we've broken something. So have a plan for mitigating a bad variant or a bad experiment. Like before you even ship it, think, okay, if we screwed up here, how would we fix this as quickly as possible? So, for example, you might use, you could use a silent push to send out to all your apps to say, right, next time you launch, you must get the latest config, else I want you to delete the config you've got right now, and sort of hide that experiment. You could ship an app with a new bundled configuration, so it's a relatively small thing to do, relatively low risk, because all you're doing is changing one config file. It's a bit of a waste of bandwidth, obviously, for users to have to do that, but it's probably preferable to them having a crap experience within your app. There's a really good Firebase video for that strategy of pushing doing a silent push to trigger an update on your next install, sorry, next launch. But do just ensure you've tested all of your experiments thoroughly before shipping. Also check that experiments don't interfere with each other. You shouldn't really be testing, say, on the same screen. You shouldn't be doing too many tests on that same screen, because you end up with a massive permutation of like 4, 6, or 8 different versions of, say, your search results screen. So it can really complicate QA efforts. And just don't ship stuff on Fridays, because if you've got people who are on call at the weekend, they don't want to be having to fix your shit that you shipped a couple of days before. And that's it. Quick questions, but we're bang on 9 o'clock, and we should probably head to the pub.